celebrate, I think, and to think about on how to improve as we move forward and continue to grow in those areas. One other thing I wanted to mention to you is there are flip boards now on the bottom floor, the ground floor. There's a couple of them there. What I would love, I've heard so many great suggestions from people and conversations that I would love to see your suggestions up there of what you would like to see in future conferences, of what you think could be made better. There is a caveat. I am very much a person who likes to think of things as growth and potential, not complaints and whining. So if you have ideas and you have suggestions, and there's always ways to improve things, that's great, but come up with a solution or a potential solution that you can put on there. It's not a complaint board. It's a here's what we could do to make us stronger board. Okay, can we agree on that? Excellent. So then one other mention I want to say is you can also purchase your carbon offset or make a donation for carbon offset. We have 2 fantastic projects that have been vetted, certified by 3 different organizations. They're both right here in Columbia, and to date we've raised over $12,000 just today. So if you have not yet donated to carbon offset, you can, and you can get this really cool stamp on your badge that says you did it. And you can do that at the booth, the SEB booth, or at registration. So I'm done with updates. Right now I'd like to introduce Kartik Shankar. He is the co-chair of this ICCB 2017 Conference Scientific Committee. Right, Kartik? Welcome. Thank you. And he's going to introduce our speakers this morning. To advance right there if you need it.
Thanks, Debbie. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to actually take a minute or half a minute to acknowledge specifically the scientific committee, which was led by Morena Mills, our chair, and my co-chair, Jimena Rueda, along with a team of about 20 other scientists. The committee, I would really like to acknowledge the effort that the entire committee put in reviewing over 1,000 abstracts and over 100 symposiums. Often at very short notices, you guys had months of notice to submit them. We often had to go review them in a matter of 4 days. And so, along with 100 other reviewers from around the world, an enormous amount of effort was put in, and I really would like to, I'd like a quick round of applause for the entire scientific committee, please. Thank you. It's an honor and an absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Robin Chasden. I could say Professor Chasden is a legend. For those of you who haven't already looked it up on your smartphones, you could do it now, and I absolutely need say no more. But for those of you who don't have an internet connection at the moment, very briefly, Professor Chasden is Professor Emerita at the Department of Ecology at the University of Connecticut. She works on successional pathways, biodiversity in human-managed landscapes, and most recently in tropical forest restoration. She's also the executive director of the Association for Tropical Biology and Conservation and director of Partners, which works on the social ecological drivers of reforestation. Professor Chasden has affiliations at universities around the world in Australia and Brazil, and is a fellow at the World Resources Institute. She has over 140 journal papers, and her book, Second Growth, The Promise of Tropical Forest Regeneration in an Age of Deforestation, is something that all of us that are interested in conservation in such landscapes today absolutely must read. Without further ado, Professor Chasden.
Excellent. Buenos dias. And good morning, everyone. And I just want to thank the scientific committee for this invitation. For me, it really is a great honor to come before you and to participate in this wonderful event. So let me just go ahead and get started. I want to give you my main messages first, so you can kind of mull over these things as I go through the talk, and then I will recapitulate at the end. And I want to just underscore that throughout my training and my experience, my focus has been on tropical forests. So that will be kind of an undertone throughout this presentation. But really, I think a lot of the messages that I'm putting forward really apply broadly to all kinds of different ecosystems and biomes and contexts across the world. So first, I just want to recognize, I think we all really need to recognize that the planet is in pretty bad shape. We've really done a lot of damage, not just in the last 50 years, but for hundreds of years. And rather than despair about this, I think this is really a call for unity and a call for us to really work together to come up with solutions that repair a lot of this damage. In my mind, conservation and restoration are very integrated topics and very integrated conceptual frameworks. And we've seen this in many, many sectors and across the world. We see this integration happening, for example, in the whole description and discussion of forest transition pathways, and in international conventions that are focusing on both conservation and the plus in red, plus additionality and new forest. We also see this in our science. There's an increasing trend toward incorporating and integrating both restoration and conservation in the research we do. But I think this has not sufficiently happened on the ground in our practice. So this is a call to all of you to seek ways to make this happen. And as I'm going to present, there are complementary functions in restoration interventions and conservation interventions that really should be celebrated and are also mutually dependent. So in many situations, as I will describe, you really can't have restoration unless you also have some conservation in the region. And also, we're not able to conserve all the species we need to without creating more habitat for them through restoration. So in order to integrate conservation and restoration, we need to kind of step back from some of our academic origins, perhaps as conservation biologists, and I include myself in that category, and really start asking new questions, applying them uniquely to this integration of restoration. So I hope, my goal is to try to convince you by the end of the talk that restoration is in fact the new conservation. So I don't need to belabor this. There are many talks at this meeting that repeat this kind of information that pretty much all around the world, and especially in the tropics, conservation is losing ground. And this is being measured and monitored in a variety of different ways, here using the human footprint, an indicator based on 8 different metrics. And the areas in orange and red have increased the human footprint over a 16-year period from 1993 to 2009. The areas in green, on the other hand, decreased the human footprint. And the point here is also that this is not happening in a uniform fashion, that these increases in human footprint are particularly affecting biodiversity hotspots around the world. So there's a very strong consequence on increasing roads and built infrastructure and human pressure on the land in areas where there's already imperiled and endemic biodiversity. And again, many of these regions are in the tropics. Another measure is the intact forest landscape, and recent projections have also shown that the extent of these intact forest landscapes around the world is declining. In some cases, not as much as in others, but these are the areas, the only areas of the world where there still are large intact areas of forest cover, and where many species will not be able to survive if that forest cover is removed or fragmented or burned or suffers mortality from all kinds of anthropogenic effects. And these arrows are just pointing to, you can't really see, there are red areas on this map where there has been a decline in intact forest cover. And it's not only in the tropics, it's also in some of the boreal zones as well. So that's the backdrop. Another metric is the Global Forest Resources Assessment, which also has shown that the world's forests are changing dramatically. And although there has been a decrease in the rate of deforestation globally, there still is a fairly high rate of deforestation in tropical regions. So by all of these metrics, we really are facing a crisis. We all know that. And we need to basically harness all of our tools and all of our frameworks and all of our political will to start reversing these trends. And I like to think about this as two sides of a coin, in this case, a Mexican coin. And on one side, we have conservation practice, which many of you in this room are doing. And this is a focus on finding effective ways to protect and sustain existing diversity of ecosystems, of habitats, of species, and their functions. So I emphasize here the protecting and sustaining focus. On the other side of the coin is restoration practice, which is focusing on effective ways to recover ecological functions, species composition, and productivity of land. So the focus is also on the same issues on the ground, but from a point of view of recovering rather than protecting and sustaining. And you might not think that there's much of a difference there. But the fact of the matter is the way these fields have developed, particularly in the academic sphere, has been rather divisive. So we have the origins of the Society for Conservation Biology and the journal Conservation Biology and conservation letters and meetings like this where the conservation biologists gather. And then on the other hand, we have restoration ecology, ecological restoration, and the Society for Ecological Restoration that is meeting in a completely separate location, actually in Iguazu Falls next month. And it's going to be largely a completely different group of people at these two meetings. How many of you in this audience plan to be going to the SER meeting? Good. I think you see about 5 hands up there. Great, see you there. So my point is that even though there are many, many common goals between these two large bodies of scientists and practitioners, they are not necessarily united in their activities. And the reason why I think this is important is shown by this photo and the one following it. This is a view of Itatiaia National Park, the first national park ever established in Brazil. It's in the southern part of Minas Gerais, and where the border is with Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro state, in the Mantiqueira mountain range. It's a beautiful, beautiful area. And you can stand at an observation deck and look out across this whole valley and see this just huge expanse of Atlantic rainforest. And then you can turn 180 degrees, and you see this. Just outside the borders of the park, this area has been completely deforested and is actually a location of 2 major hydroelectric reservoirs for that serve to produce electricity for Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. So standing right there at the edge of that huge protected area and then looking out at this huge expanse of degraded land, much of this is degraded land, some of it is productive agriculture, brings home this just tremendous feeling that there's something we're not doing right here. Okay. And I think that what the issue of integrating conservation and restoration really crosses a lot across the entire hierarchy of biological organization, from very basics of how land is managed within a particular property to the habitat, ecosystem, and whole landscape scale. And I think that at each of these hierarchical levels, this integration can and should be taking place. So one framework that I'd just like to bring up is this forest transition curve. And this is basically a pattern described by geographers who were looking at past long-term changes in forest cover, primarily in developed countries like in Europe, also in the United States, and noting that as economic development took place over time, forests were cleared, agriculture was established, and then later, over time, forests began to either be regrown or planted. And that led to an increase in the forest cover. And we've seen this happen in many countries, particularly in the temperate zone in the world. And in this case, this curve is shown in terms of carbon stock instead of forest cover. And you can look at many different qualities on the y-axis here. And over time, what you're seeing is a shift from forest conservation, or simply leaving the forest alone, to use of the forest leading to degradation, to deforestation, complete deforestation and conversion of forest ecosystems to agriculture. And then at some later time, you begin to see introduction of tree cover in previously deforested regions. It can be either in mosaic landscapes or it can be in remnant areas that continue to grow. Or in woodlots that people are planting to provide timber and firewood. The shortage of wood has created this need to create more tree cover. And that is what the forest transition is showing. And one recent study, so where is this going to lead, and how can this be used to integrate conservation with these new forms of forest cover that are emerging, and also protecting what small remnants of original forest cover there may have been. I don't see these as two separate activities. I really see these as integrated activities that need to happen at the landscape scale. This is just a diagram showing these different phases of the forest transition. There's a pre-transition phase and then early and late transition where the rate of deforestation begins to slow down, and then the post-transition where you're beginning to see a shift in the direction of that curve upwards. And in this study by Hosanuma et al., they actually looked at 100 countries around the world and labeled them according to what phase of the forest transition that country was in. And there are some issues with this approach, but what I want to point out is that lightest green color, the post-forest transition, it shows up in China and India. And these are countries that have been massively focusing on reforestation. And this is starting to show. And they have actually gone through their forest transition, and now they're on the other side. And what do we do? How do we call that conservation? How do we make that work for conservation? And then the countries that are in the late stage also, they're ones we can really target to mold in a way the kind of new forest growth that these countries are experiencing and are encouraging, to make that more compatible with a conservation agenda. In the early and pre-stages, those countries really need to focus on protecting important forests and other ecosystems before they're degraded and before they're converted. So at all stages of the forest transition, there are targeted interventions that are appropriate that merge restoration and conservation. In order to really create a new forest from a deforest, you need to have, ideally, you need to have some connection with what was there before. And even if the goal is not to completely recreate the forest that was originally there, you need elements in the landscape. You need what we call ecological memory, so that regrowing areas can begin to reassemble at least some of the basic biological components of the prior ecosystem. This is the hope for restoration, to actually conserve species. And it requires that there be remnants, not necessarily a fully protected national park, but there be remnant habitats or fragments in the landscape that can provide sources, propagules, and habitats as well for the future regrowth of forests in that area. So there's a very strong dependency of the potential for natural regeneration of forests and the presence within that landscape of remnant vegetation. Another important part of that is that people are now beginning to look at where natural regeneration is occurring. Even if the whole country isn't going through a forest transition, this can be happening on a much more regional, local scale, and you probably know areas of the world where this is happening. And when you look at where the new forests are coming up or have come up, this is a study in North Queensland by Sean Sloan and others, it becomes pretty obvious in almost all of these studies that the most important determinant of where secondary forests are is how close they are to primary forests. And this study found that 97% of the secondary forests in this whole region were within 1 kilometer of a primary forest edge. So what the role of secondary forests is really extending out sort of the influence of these primary forests. So there's a very strong centering of these areas, but also the secondary forests are allowing the edges and the borders of these fragments to be expanded. And that can be a very important role for conservation. 20 years ago, in 1997, this paper came out in an issue of Science magazine that focused on conservation and restoration. And I went back and looked at this paper with new eyes. I read it in 1997. And it got stuck in there somewhere. But I went back and read it again because sometimes I like to see where ideas came from and how they've changed over time. And there's a quote in this paper that really struck me. The authors said, "From the perspective of conservation biology, it is essential that restoration is undertaken before substantial losses of biodiversity have occurred." And this could have been written a month ago as a policy brief in Science magazine. We are still saying the same thing. So I hope that this doesn't fall on deaf ears today and that really we take this on as a charge, because neither the restoration world nor the conservation world wants to lose species. We're here to try to protect species and avoid extinction. And both are necessary to do this. So I think this paper signaled a real focus on restoration as a tool for conservation, sort of as a servant for the broader objective of conservation. And I think that is still very much the case in much of the world of restoration. But there is still a large component of people who work with restoration who don't see what they're doing as a tool for conservation. They're seeing it more as a tool for food security, as a tool for wood supply, and as a tool for production of ecosystem services, mostly water provision and improving water quality and water flows for rural residents as well as for urban societies. And in much of the restoration literature that I am looking at and reading, you don't always see biodiversity mentioned up front and center. So this is something I've been working on with the World Resources Institute and other restoration movements to really kind of try to bring it back a bit to where it all began. But also recognizing that can't be the sole motivation for restoration. There are other really important recovery processes that need to happen as well. And this cartoon that was in that Dobson paper comes from Bradshaw's work earlier, one of the founders of the field of restoration ecology, and it's been used over and over again, and I really have a problem with this graph. I don't think it works. Time is missing here. And it's just like you instantly go from an original ecosystem to a degraded ecosystem, and then you go back again on the same trajectory. And boom, you're back there. And it doesn't happen that way. And it takes a very long time. And there's a lot of deviations in that pathway, and you end up somewhere else. And some people might say, well, then you haven't really restored. But, sometimes that's the best that we can do. And we shouldn't quit trying to improve the situation that we find following degradation. But what is interesting in this paper is that they pointed out that really restoration should become part of the conservation biologist toolbox. Basically, it should become part of the training and part of the thinking and part of the framework. And I really agree with that. There's been a few other papers that have tried to merge conservation and restoration. So I've obviously read all of those. And this one by Weens and Hobbs also made a really strong statement that I'd like to emphasize here. And here they looked at different pathways. So here they did implicitly involve time, but again, the time element is really kind of missing from here as well. So where you have interventions that are focused on conservation, they're focused mostly on areas with high conservation value on the x-axis. Let's see, how do I, here. And the goal is to keep them at that high conservation value. So the conservation intervention is working to keeping the ecosystem way up there. When you have restoration, you're dealing with a failure in conservation or a lack of intervention. And you have the current state, is down here at some lower level or a very low level of conservation value. And in this case, there are several different directions that can go into. That could stay where it is in a low conservation value state, or you can apply some restoration interventions to push that up, to move it up the ladder in terms of conservation value. And this can happen through passive as well as through active restoration interventions. What I struggle with is really, what do you call this? In my work with secondary forests, I have run into a lot of obstruction in terms of people saying, oh, well, those aren't really worth conserving. We should really focus on conserving the old growth forests. And I kind of smiled and walked away. But really, this is a very important question because most of the tropical forest out there is not in this high conservation value state. Most of the areas out there have been impacted by human activities, in some cases in a very strong way. So what do we do with all those logged forests out there? What do we do with all those secondary forests out there that are regrowing passively? Do we conserve them? And I really think that we should. I think that that's part of this integration of conservation and restoration that I think we should be working towards. In many cases, we're not dealing with intact forest landscapes in most parts of the world. And most parts of the world in the tropics look more like this. It's a mosaic landscape with all kinds of different land use and people living there and shifting cultivation or gardens or part of a small oil palm plantation or a tree plantation or up on the hill way far away, a little remnant of forest. And these are the landscapes where we really need to be actively working on the ground to merge our conservation and restoration work. And one of the quotes in that Weens paper really caught my eye because I haven't been talking very much about people. But when you really move out of these intact forest landscapes, you're dealing with people, you're dealing with communities. And it's essential that they be part of the solution and not be viewed as the problem. And I like this quote because they talk about how people are part of nature, which I firmly believe, and they are also part of the solution to our environmental problems. and that both the tools of both disciplines of ecology and restoration are really needed to move these landscapes into a better place. Several years ago, a group of us were called together to work on a paper looking at the potential for conservation of species in secondary forests in the tropics, and this was the result. And one of the things we did was pool together all the data we could find that looked at trends across succession. And when we did that, we really found that it was very clear to all of us that it was very important that both old growth and second growth forests are critical for the persistence of biodiversity, and in particularly forest species, forest requiring species in landscapes, in these human modified landscapes. And our results, since that time, this was in 2009, there's really been a huge explosion of research, which is wonderful to see. Looking at, over time, what is the recovery, or what is the abundance of old growth species that you find in old growth in second growth forests. And in all of the taxa that have been looked at, we do find these trends that over time, more and more of these forest species are finding homes in these regrowth forests. Part of the trend that I've seen is an increasing integration in the literature of both restoration and conservation. So I decided to take a look using the Web of Science. And I searched on papers that had both restoration and conservation in the title of a journal article. I didn't restrict the journal, but I restricted the search to articles in journals. And what I found was two things. 40, a total of 40 by last year, which seemed to me a pretty small number. But it's exponentially increasing and doubling every 5 years. So pretty soon we're going to be having 80, then 160, and more papers that are integrating these two topics. And this doesn't mean that they're not happening in the article. This means that the authors chose to put both of those words in the title of their paper. So I wanted to have a pretty high bar for this. So this was suggestive that more and more researchers are really integrating these topics in their work. And I looked at what journals this is happening in. So this is the ranking of the journals in terms of how many of these papers were published there. And it's very interesting that they're coming from both restoration fields and from conservation fields. I should say conservation biology and conservation letters were kind of way down on that list. A lot of applied journals. So engineering, applied ecological engineering, applied vegetation science, Journal of Applied Ecology. So that's good, because that's where the practitioners are looking, and those are the journals where we really want to see this integration. So I think that those are the front line of this movement. So as I mentioned earlier, I think to get to where we need to go, we need to shift the questions we're asking. So I'm going to give a few examples here of questions that were very important in framing the conservation research that many of us have done, but looking at this in terms of restoration. So the first question is, how much intact forest is needed to sustain forest biodiversity? And this had to do with the whole reserve size argument and many issues like that. And that question is being turned around from a restoration perspective to ask, what are the minimal levels of components of biodiversity that are needed to sustain forest regeneration and promote connectivity for forest species? So what does it take in a degraded landscape to make that begin to work to favor the lives of forest species? And one example that I want to give is an extensive study in Atlantic forest, Brazil, that looked at mammals, birds, and amphibians. And then the vertebrates column is all those groups combined. It's not all vertebrates. And this graph shows on the x-axis is the percentage of forest cover within a landscape, which is usually about a 5,000 hectare polygon. And on the y-axis is the relative abundance. And species are divided into two groups. Groups that are forest dependent versus, or groups associated with forest versus groups that are associated with disturbance. The forest species are shown in red, and the disturbance species are shown in blue. And what you see is a switchover in these landscapes from 0 to 100% forest cover of these two types of forest groups. We could have drawn that on a piece of paper without even seeing any data, right? But here are data. And what is interesting about the data is that they show sort of where this crosses over. So what amount of forest cover needs to be in the landscape to really support forest requiring species and to maintain at least a fairly high species composition relative to a fully forested area. So the bottom graph is showing community similarity to forests with full forest cover. And what all of these groups indicated was that between 20 and 40%, there's this real shift, a turning point, almost a tipping point. You can look at it as a tipping point either direction. But in terms of restoration, this would be a target. And believe it or not, in most areas of the Atlantic forests, there's far less than 20 to 30% forest cover. And they then looked, I'm sorry, I'll show that graph later. So a second question with conservation is, what are the anthropogenic drivers of forest degradation and deforestation? This has been a huge question. Books, volumes written on this topic. From the restoration perspective, we're asking a different question. We're asking, what are the social and ecological drivers of forest restoration and regeneration and reforestation? And this is what the Partners Working Group has been focused on. So there's also examples of this in the literature. Most recently, a major meta-analysis looking at the ecological drivers of forest restoration success in studies around the world. And the main drivers were the time, so with time, success is higher, and disturbance type, so with more intensive disturbance, it takes longer to reach success, and the landscape context, how much forest cover there is in the landscape. So a third question that has been a big focus of conservation effort is, how do we do it? How do we plan interventions and spatial locations for conserving nature that minimize the loss of unique species and habitats, but at a minimal cost? So this is the strategic conservation planning approach. And now we are also applying, in many areas, strategic restoration planning approaches that also have a very similar methodology. But here, it's planning investments and spatial locations for restoration that achieve multiple benefits, not only conservation of biodiversity, and that do it at a minimal cost. So one example of this effort is an ongoing project also in Atlantic Forest of Brazil, using a systematic restoration planning approach. So in this case, there are three main layers of information. One is endemic biodiversity. This involves species distribution maps of over 8,000 endemic species of mammals and plants and birds, and I think amphibians. So what you see highlighted in blue on the left-hand map, number 1, are those regions of highest biodiversity concentration of endemic species. The map number 2 is those areas that would store the most amount of carbon if they were restored. And number 3 are those areas that have the lowest costs. And that generally corresponds to areas that are have a high capacity for natural regeneration, so tree planting does not need to be done. And then the final map is a multi-criteria map that combines all three of those in a systematic way to look at the multiple benefits for minimal cost. So look for that paper next year. Internationally, there's a huge effort, mostly organized by the UN Convention on Biological Diversity to really push forward a strategic plan for biodiversity. And this should be 2020, not 2010, my error. These Aichi targets are being used to motivate countries to push forward on a whole variety of plans to protect and restore biodiversity. And I just want to quickly show you what these targets mean in terms of conservation and restoration. So the big ones that mostly come up are Target 11, which is focused on protecting at least 17% of terrestrial and inland water ecosystems and 10% of coastal and marine areas through effective conservation. Target 14 is focused on restoration, mostly of ecosystem services related to water and health provision for people. So this is more restoration for human well-being. And Target 15 puts out a plan of, through conservation and restoration, of at least 15% of degraded ecosystems. So focuses particularly on that and encourages countries to restore 15% of those. Also, the Convention on Biological Diversity has, together with the Korean Forest Service, been supporting an initiative on forest ecosystem restoration and financing small projects around the world that are really integrate the goals of all of these multiple Aichi targets, but that are all focused on restoration initiatives. So here we are at the highest level of our international conventions. It's being done. And some work done by people in that office who work with the CBD that say outright that ecosystem restoration is being viewed as an essential part of efforts to protect biodiversity and contribute to sustainable development. So that is their bottom line. Also, the climate change agreement in Paris strongly emphasized the role of forests and forest conservation and restoration as ways of achieving control of our temperature increase and increasing sinks and reservoirs for greenhouse gases, including forests. So I mentioned earlier several studies in the Atlantic forest, and in this case, the focus of this study was how can we prioritize restoration to conserve biodiversity in this region. And they looked at how much forest cover were in each of these 5,000 hectare polygons across the Atlantic forest. So the green that you see there is forest cover, but if you look closely, you'll see little speckles of green all over the place. Those are the remnant fragments of the Atlantic forest that across all the Atlantic forest compose 12% of the land area. That is all that's left. And this is a biodiversity hotspot. So what they did was they first looked at the distribution. They found that 85% of those landscapes had less than 20% forest cover. And they call those low resilience. They found that 10% have an intermediate level of forest cover. And if all of those could be restored, that would account for 15 million hectares. 5% of those polygons are what they would consider sources of biodiversity, with more than 60 or, depending on the connectivity between them, 40 and 60% forest cover. Those were considered landscapes that had sufficient forest cover to really serve as sources of propagules for the intermediate. So they decided to focus their restoration framework on these intermediate landscapes. There's still a lot of hope for boosting these up to that level where they could sustain higher levels of species. And then they looked further within that intermediate group to rank those areas according to how they could be positioned to serve as biological corridors, so further increasing their value. And from this, they were able to really identify priority areas for restoration within this huge region. And another study also in Brazil looked at how conservation and restoration could be incorporated in restoration planning. And in this case, they accounted for effects of climate change and the need for species to expand beyond the forest fragments in which they're found. And in this case, the scenario that involved conservation of the fragments followed by restoration is the only way that you can reach 17% of that target 11. Because recall, most of this is below the 17% level. So even if they conserved every single fragment that they could find in the Atlantic forest, it wouldn't be sufficient. So in this case, the partner to conservation is restoration. And there's been a really amazing effort in Mexico to also use restoration to guide planning within the country. And what's amazing about this is they mapped priority areas using extensive information from CONABIO, from the Biodiversity Institute in Mexico, which is part of a government, to map areas that maximized both the importance of biology, basically conservation value, using endemic species, but also that offered higher feasibility for restoration. And those are the darker brown areas in this priority map. And what's really interesting is that when you look at the percentage of the full range of species in which they actually are protected, in the protected area, a very low proportion of species have protected areas within their geographic range in Mexico. So if you add in the extra additional priority areas in the middle, then you boost that curve up quite a bit. But when you also include the sites of high priority restoration, you really push that up to over 50% safety net for those species. One other example in Australia, this is in the Coral Sea in Borneo, looking at whether you do conservation or restoration, what's the best approach? And I just want to highlight that in this case, this is a mangrove conservation project. The simulations that they did actually showed that if you just do restoration from the onset, you can actually protect more coastal area than if you do conservation from the onset. And the main reason is because you decrease the amount of unprotected and degraded land, offering more habitat for mangroves. And clearly, when you do the restoration scenario, you protect a much larger amount of coastal area than if you just protect in specific areas. So it's not always true that protecting first is better. You need to actually run through the scenarios to really find out what's the optimal timing of these different interventions. So just to summarize how conservation and restoration are different and how they are the same. With restoration here, we're prioritizing areas in terms of our objectives that have moderate or relatively moderate levels of degradation or relatively recent degradation, because these are the ones that offer the greatest potential for improvement. Whereas conservation is focused more on intact areas and protecting them. In restoration, we prioritize areas that have a high potential to increase biodiversity and ecosystem functions. Whereas in conservation, we're focusing on areas that already are showing the highest potential, the highest possible levels. From restoration, we want to restore habitats to minimize extinction debt, to prevent loss of species following habitat destruction. In conservation, we're protecting habitats to minimize species loss in the first place. But both conservation and restoration strive to provide opportunities for economic gain and livelihoods through their interventions, and both strive to maximize cost effectiveness in these endeavors. So I just want to end with this graph, which kind of is, in my mind, how we can really merge restoration and conservation. Starting on the right-hand side of the graph, where we have high levels of habitat that are remaining intact. We can focus on a variety of interventions depending on the population density in the area and what we can reasonably achieve without forcing people off the land. And this ranges from community reserves to multiple use areas to strict reserves. And on the left side of the spectrum, where we're dealing with areas where there's this very little natural habitat remaining, we can do restoration interventions. We can do this in urban areas with high populations, or in agroforestry, woodlots, silvopastoral systems. And then here, where we're in remote areas, we can actually do real ecosystem restoration as well. But there's a lot of space overlapping up here. And this is where I think we have a huge potential for using natural regeneration, assisted regeneration, agroforestry in buffer zones of existing protected areas to extend these areas out further. And also to link existing conservation areas with biological corridors, and to either widen these corridors or to construct them in the first place to increase the effectiveness of conservation. So here we're really combining both restoration and conservation. This is just to say that not all restoration can really be done with the goal of optimizing biodiversity conservation, because in some areas the state of degradation has been so high that really rehabilitation or reclamation interventions are needed, and those are not necessarily going to be tools for conservation, but they will provide productive activities that can remove pressure on existing areas. So here were my main messages. I'm not going to recapitulate all of them, but I do want to add one more, which is that some people may view restoration as sort of a Band-Aid or as a quick fix to just sort of spruce things up and make them look better, but it isn't. It really is a very long-term process, and it is a fundamental component of forest, regional and global life support systems. So we really need to have restoration to keep our planet going. So thank you very much.
Thank you for a fantastic talk. We have time for a couple of questions. Yes.
How we frame our restoration goals? Or can you just repeat that?
Sorry about that. Thank you very much. That was super interesting. I guess there's just a lot of debate about how we frame restoration goals when we're trying to think about climate change, because restoration traditionally was very much about the historic baseline, and now we're thinking about the future and things changing. And there doesn't seem to be much consensus on how we actually account for what the change might be. I was just wondering your opinion on that.
No, I think that one of the models that I showed you is trying to incorporate that. So when we do have some reasonably certain, and it's very uncertain what will happen, but how climates are going to shift within a region, I think that's the time when we need to bring the restoration community and the conservation community together to work on a strategy that will protect species in the new climate regime, and also make decisions about planting, what species that should be planted that are going to be able to survive in new climate regime. So this is a huge effort. It's hard to know exactly what to do, because if you're making a long-term commitment to replant a forest, which would take 100 years, you want it to be able to start now, the way the climate is now, but you want it to be able to continue growing in the next 100 years or 500 years. So you have to take some chances. I think it's important to think about the species that are there now, and then species that we expect will be able to move into that region and survive, and do some sort of mixture to hedge your bets. But I mean, I don't think we're going to be able to engineer this completely perfectly.
First of all, thanks for a very inspiring presentation. My name is Bengt-Gunnar Jonsson, and I work in the boreal forest in Northern Europe. And we do restoration quite a lot. But we are also, well, besides the sort of land use conflicts with forest companies and so on, we're also facing some complaints from conservation groups and some people within authorities around the sort of more philosophical, ethical aspects of doing active intervention. The idea is that, well, let's take the human use out of the area and let nature heal itself because it knows best how to do it. Is this even an issue in the tropical area? Is there sort of a philosophical, moral debate on what we can do and should do?
Yes, I would say so. And it's something I've been pushing very heavily over the past few years, and a big topic I'm working on now, which is to appreciate the potential for natural regeneration to do this job without requiring extensive, costly interventions. But that will not happen everywhere. So the key is to really understand, and some of the studies I showed are beginning to guide us in how we can map these out with fairly high certainty, so that we can allocate the efforts that are needed for more costly interventions to those areas where that's really required. And that's the only way we're going to be able to achieve the targets that we're after.
Thanks a lot, Robin, for the presentation. What do you find the best ways to make restoration efforts on private land permanent, given that private land can change hands through time?
Well, I know of some efforts in the United States that are very successful involving conservation easements that I think could be adopted in tropical countries and developing countries even. There are community reserves on private land. This is a system that's working well in Brazil, but it's very difficult to achieve and costs money to achieve. So this should be made easier, for one, so that if individual land ownership changes, this area is still in a community-held reserve and can't be converted. The mandatory restoration in Brazil, this is a big experiment, and it remains to be seen how much is really going to happen, how many people will really comply. They're trying to put everything in order to make that happen, but the landowners have to pay for the restoration, and many of them probably aren't willing to do that. So there's all kinds of ideas that are floating around to how to make it work better, but